Video game history is a fascinating topic, and I'm going to show you some of the sources and resources I utilize to learn about it right now. While video games are fun to play, there is a special dimension added to the experience when you learn about how the games you play and love came to be. There's corporate drama, betrayals, personal struggles and victories, and a slew of stories behind the scenes that have fascinated video game audiences for decades. Since video games are such a large part of pop culture, there are thousands of facets to video game history. Fortunately, there are more than a few adept individuals and enthusiasts who are happy to help chronicle them. I learn about video game history through a number of sources and resources, and I'm happy to give you a rundown of the media I find most useful and informative. Before we get started, I'm creating more educational content for this channel. If you get any enjoyment or value out of this video, go ahead and thwip on the like button and consider subscribing. Also, if you have any ideas for DLC topics, please go ahead and sound off in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And back to it. So the one YouTube channel right now that I go to with any regularity for video game history is The Gaming Historian. Norman Caruso has basically made a career out of doing deep dives on specific games, specific series, companies, and he's got a very big YouTube channel that has a whole lot of in-depth material that I really do enjoy. So he is a really good source as a YouTube channel. I'm sure there are others, I just haven't discovered them yet. So again, please feel free to let me know what YouTubers you like to go to for video game history. When it comes to podcasts, I've got 3 podcasts that I really do enjoy listening to. Codex, History of Video Games, is a podcast I discovered about a year ago, and it must have been kismet because right as I discovered that podcast, they were starting their History of Spider-Man segment, the History of Spider-Man video games. It was a wonderful segment, and as I continued to listen to it, I found that the hosts, Mike and Tyler, they do a whole lot of research for their episodes, but they also have a kind of friendly banter that is at times funny, and that is very casual and accessible. It's a show that I really enjoy and that I think anyone who is interested in video game history should take a look at. The second podcast that I enjoy is New Game Plus. This is an interesting take on video game history because these gentlemen, Nolan, Dustin, and Kenny, they don't talk about video game history. What they do is they select a new retro game for the next podcast and they spend a week playing it, and then they talk about the retro games. They also have a really amusing dynamic between the 3 of them, and there is a whole lot of humor and a whole lot of insight that comes out of what they have to say about the games that they've been playing. It's really funny when one of them really doesn't like the game that they've been playing and they're kind of grouchy about it, and it comes through into the podcast. It's a lot of fun and definitely worth checking out. Finally, the Video Game History Hour is a podcast that is put out by, I think it's the Video Game Preservation Society. And this is a really interesting podcast in the sense that they do interviews with people who are currently or formerly engaged in some aspect of video game history, video game preservation, and it's a more, I would say it's a little bit less casual in terms of tone, but it's very kind of scholarly and very professorly. I think it's a really good kind of counterpoint to Codex and New Game Plus, and I think really kind of works very well for the show. As a librarian, it's only fitting that I talk about a couple of books on the history of video games, and one of the ones that I have enjoyed the most is Game On, a video game history from Pong and Pac-Man to Mario and Minecraft and more. This book has a lot of short segments on various aspects of video game history, from Atari all the way up to Minecraft and more. and is a lot of fun to read. You can read it in a lot of little snippets, and it's a lot of fun to kind of just pick up, peruse a section, and then you can put it down. If you want, you could read the whole thing through, but I don't think it's really designed that way. It was published in 2016 by Dustin Hanson, and is one of those books that I have occasionally brought home. I read it, I just read little parts of it, and then I put it away, and then I come back to it weeks or months, or sometimes years later. So definitely recommend it. This next book is a book I actually have not read, but as much as I love the Codex podcast, Tyler and Mike highly recommend The Ultimate History of Video Games. They go through the book in chapters, and the author, Stephen L. Kent, has definitely had his hand in the video game industry throughout his journalism career. Codex also does a series on the various chapters of this book, and the second one. Stephen L. Kent recently put out a volume 2 of The Ultimate History of Video Games. And again, while I haven't read them, I certainly plan to in the near future. For those of you who like watching television shows and or movies, I highly recommend Netflix's High Score. This series came out about a year and a half ago, and it was a lot of fun to watch. It chronicles various aspects of video game history, specific people, and it has kind of a loose chronology, but it's more thematically based. I believe the show had 6 episodes, and it talks about people who lived through various points of video game history, including a couple of contest winners. It talks about Ken and Roberta Williams, who created the Sierra Online series of video games, I think starting with King's Quest. It's a lot of fun. I know that some of the critics said that this was kind of like a dumbed-down version of video game history. I found it to be very fascinating and compelling, and highly recommended. I have not heard any word of a second season for this show, which is going to be really unfortunate if that's the case, because I thought this first season was really good and deserves to be expanded on. We'll see. And finally, there is a movie called The History of Video Games. Now, this movie was made in 2004, so it's 17 years old as of this recording. And I have watched it before, and it's really good. It does a kind of survey of the history of video games up to, I think, the late 90s or early 2000s, and was a lot of fun to watch. It was a good kind of overview of how video games kind of evolved from, I believe, the late 70s or early 80s, all the way up to what back then was the present day. It is a little dated, but I think it has a lot of value kind of as a historical document and movie about video game history that itself, you could say, could have its own history. While I love the topic of video game history, I know I haven't seen all of the resources out there. So if you find this topic as fascinating as I do, please go ahead and drop in the comments some suggestions you have for what video game history resources I might find equally fascinating.